My name is Maya. I am 29 years old and a forensic accountant. Right now, I am sitting in my childhood dining room and cold sweat is dripping down my back. The air in this room is heavy and suffocating. It smells of stale scotch and raw terror. Across the mahogany table stands my father, Richard. He is sweating profusely. His dress shirt clings to his chest, and his silk tie has been ripped away. His eyes are completely bloodshot, darting around the room like an unhinged animal. He breathes in ragged, heavy gasps that echo in the dead silence of the house. He raises his trembling hand and violently slams a thick stack of asset transfer documents onto the polished wood. The thud makes the crystal glasses in the china cabinet rattle. He shoves the papers toward me and demands that I sign them immediately, swearing that nobody leaves the room until I do. I do not move. My silence makes him snap. He reaches into the waistband of his trousers. The harsh glare of the chandelier catches the cold metallic glint of a Glock 19. Before I can even process the movement, he lunges forward across the table. He grabs a fistful of my hair and presses Sussy the steel barrel of the gun directly against my right temple. The metal bites into my skin, sending a shockwave of ice through my veins. I can feel his hand shaking against my skull. In the corner of the room, my older sister Vanessa lets out a blood-curdling scream. It is a visceral sound of absolute terror. She drops to her knees, covering her face and sobbing uncontrollably as she watches our father hold a loaded weapon to my head. But it is my mother, Sandra, who truly breaks my heart. She does not scream. She does not run to protect me. Instead, she shrinks into the dark shadows by the front entryway. Her knuckles are white as she clutches the heavy brass deadbolt keys tightly against her chest. She locked the doors herself to make sure I could not escape. Her face is chalk white, but her voice is steady as she mutters under her breath. She tells me to just sign it. She tells me to stop being selfish and sign the papers to save this family. They expect me to break. They have spent my entire life breaking me down and forcing me into submission. They treat me like a tool to be used and discarded whenever they are in trouble. They expect tears. They expect me to pick up that pen and sign my life away to save them from the consequences of their own actions. But the little girl who used to cower in fear is gone. I am a forensic accountant. I uncover hidden truths for a living, and I already know exactly how this night ends. I do not cry. I do not beg for my life. I slowly raise my head, feeling the cold steel of the gun slide against my skin. I look my father dead in his desperate bloodshot eyes, and I smile. It is a genuine, chilling smile. I see the confusion wash over his face. He does not understand why his ultimate threat is failing. A split second later, a deafening crash shakes the entire house. The front door is kicked open with such explosive force that the wooden frame splinters into pieces. The deafening knock shatters the silence completely. Men in tactical gear flood the hallway, shouting orders. And walking right behind them, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos, is my lawyer, Jonathan Davis. Jonathan. The trap has snapped shut, but not on me. Before I show you exactly what was inside my lawyer's sealed briefcase, the evidence that sent my own father to federal prison, take a second to hit like and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to the edge by your own toxic family. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I love connecting with you all. How does a normal family dinner turn into an armed hostage situation? It was not random. The dominoes started falling exactly 7 days ago when I was forced to clean up the rotting financial books of my family business. To understand the sheer magnitude of my father's desperation, you have to understand the trap he set for me 1 week earlier. 7 days ago, my phone rang at 11 at night. It was my mother, Sandra. Her tone was sweet and dripping with that artificial warmth she only used when she needed a major favor. She told me my father was dealing with a tiny accounting error at the office. She said they had a routine tax audit coming up, and his bookkeeper was out sick. She asked if I could be a good daughter and come take a quick look, claiming it would only take an hour of my time. I should have said no. I should have hung up the phone and gone to sleep. But the guilt conditioning runs deep in our family. For as long as I can remember, my role in the household was the fixer. I was the invisible workhorse, while my older sister Vanessa was the cherished princess. If Vanessa needed a new car, my parents would empty their savings. If I needed textbooks for college, my father would tell me that higher education was a waste of money for someone with my ordinary potential. I spent my entire youth trying to earn a fraction of the affection they showered on my sister. I became a top-tier financial investigator because I learned early on that I had to rely entirely on my own intellect to survive. When I arrived at Jenkins Logistics the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. The company was my father's pride and joy. It was a mid-sized freight and shipping business that funded my parents' lavish lifestyle and my sister's endless shopping sprees. The office was located in a busy commercial district, but stepping inside felt like entering a mausoleum. The employees looked stressed and avoided eye contact. My father sat behind his massive oak desk, looking thoroughly disheveled. He did not greet me with a hug or a thank you. He just gestured to a massive stack of disorganized ledgers and a portable hard drive. He told me the IRS was doing a random compliance check, and he needed me to clean up the mess and make the numbers balance perfectly. I reminded him that I am a forensic accountant. I told him I do not forge numbers, I investigate them. I told him my professional license was on the line if I submitted fraudulent financial statements. He waved his hand dismissively and told me not to be so dramatic. He just wanted me to organize the files and make everything look pretty for the auditors, so the family could get through the week without a massive fine. My mother walked into the office right at that moment, placing a cup of coffee on my desk. She sighed heavily and begged me not to start arguments today. She reminded me that Vanessa was busy planning her dream wedding and that everyone was very stressed about the catering deposits. She asked why I always had to complain when they asked me to contribute my fair share to the family that raised me. There it was again, the classic emotional manipulation. She had to remind me that Vanessa's life was the ultimate priority, and my professional integrity was entirely secondary. She looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes, making it clear that my refusal would be viewed as an act of profound betrayal. I swallowed my frustration and agreed to review the files. I told myself I was doing it to protect the family business and to keep a roof over their heads. I reasoned that it was just messy bookkeeping from a negligent employee. I did not know I was stepping directly into a financial bear trap designed to send me to federal prison. As I began sorting through the digital files, my trained eyes immediately caught massive anomalies. The ledgers were not just messy, they were deliberately chaotic. There were strange recurring wire transfers to offshore accounts in jurisdictions known for corporate secrecy. There were massive cash payments to consulting firms that did not exist outside of a registered post office box. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the company under the guise of operational expenses. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was not a struggling business trying to survive a bad quarter. This was a systematic operation designed to launder money and hide staggering amounts of illegal gambling debt. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying the numbers became. The company was essentially a hollow shell, completely insolvent and drowning in liabilities. But the real horror, the discovery that would eventually put a gun to my head, was yet to come. I opened a restricted folder labeled for banking compliance, and my heart stopped. I saw pages of loan applications, tax documents, and credit line extensions. At the bottom of every single one of those fraudulent documents was a signature. It was my signature. My father had officially listed me as the Chief Financial Officer of Jenkins Logistics 3 years ago without my knowledge. He had been forging my signature on every illegal transaction, every fake tax return, and every fraudulent bank loan. He had meticulously built a paper trail that pointed directly to me. I was digging through a graveyard of severe financial crimes, and my father was handing me the shovel. The stage was set. The bait was laid. I was just the obedient daughter trying to help my family survive a difficult week. I had absolutely no idea that my father had already planned to sacrifice my freedom to save his own. He was preparing to hand me over to the federal authorities as the mastermind behind the entire collapse. The real nightmare had just begun, and I realized that my own parents were the monsters waiting in the dark. The rain was coming down in thick, heavy sheets, slapping against the windshield of my 10-year-old sedan as I drove across town at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I was utterly exhausted. My eyes burned from staring at dual monitors at my accounting firm for 10 hours straight. All I wanted was a hot shower and my bed. Instead, I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached, heading straight toward the industrial park on the edge of the city. My phone had rung 20 minutes earlier. It was my mother, Sandra. She did not ask how my day was. She did not ask if I was asleep. She simply demanded that I get to Jenkins Logistics immediately because my father had a situation and they needed me to fix it. Jenkins Logistics was the family business. It was a mid-sized freight shipping company that my father, Richard, had run for the past 2 decades. To the outside world, it was the portrait of American success. It funded my parents' sprawling 4-bedroom house, the country club memberships, and a life of comfortable luxury. But the reality behind closed doors was a completely different story. I parked in the dimly lit lot and used my old spare key to unlock the heavy glass door. The warehouse smelled like diesel exhaust and damp cardboard. I walked up the metal stairs to the executive suite. The lights were blazing. When I pushed open the frosted glass door to my father's office, I was met with a scene of absolute chaos. Richard was standing behind his massive oak desk. His tie was loosened, his collar was unbuttoned, and his face was flushed a deep mottled red. The desk was completely buried under towering stacks of manila folders, loose receipts, printed spreadsheets, and crumpled bank statements. He looked up at me with wild, frantic eyes. He did not say hello. He did not say thank you for coming. He just pointed a trembling finger at the mountain of paperwork. He told me the IRS had issued a notice for a comprehensive audit. They were coming in less than 14 days. He slammed his hand flat on a stack of invoices and demanded that I clean up the books. He said his regular bookkeeper had suddenly quit and left everything in a catastrophic mess. He wanted me to organize the files, make the numbers balance perfectly, and ensure the auditors found absolutely nothing out of place. He wanted me to do it quickly, quietly, and entirely for free. I stood there in my damp trench coat, feeling a familiar heavy knot form in my stomach. I am a forensic accountant. I track missing funds, identify corporate fraud, and untangle complex financial webs for major corporations. I do not forge numbers, and I certainly do not magically fix years of negligent bookkeeping overnight. I tried to explain this to him. I told him my professional license was on the line if I manipulated financial records. I told him that an IRS audit was a serious legal matter, and that he needed to hire a specialized tax attorney and a dedicated firm to handle this properly. My father sneered at me. He dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, calling me dramatic and ungrateful. He said I was supposed to be the financial genius of the family, and that I owed it to him to use my skills to protect the business that put food on my plate when I was a child. Before I could defend myself, the office door swung open and my mother, Sandra, walked in. She was holding a cup of herbal tea, looking perfectly put together despite the late hour. Her blonde hair was immaculate, and she wore a cashmere cardigan that cost more than my monthly car payment. She did not offer me a drink. She simply walked over to my father and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder before turning her cold, piercing blue eyes on me. She sighed heavily, a sound I had heard 1,000 times before. It was the sound of profound disappointment in my very existence. She told me I was being incredibly selfish. She reminded me that my older sister Vanessa was right in the middle of planning her dream wedding. Vanessa was marrying an incredibly successful tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. Their wedding was going to be the social event of the year. Sandra had been obsessing over every detail, from the imported orchids to the custom silk table linens. Sandra crossed her arms and delivered the ultimate emotional blow. She said, "Your sister is busy planning her dream wedding. Maya, the least you can do is check some spreadsheets." The dynamic of our family was crystallized in that single cruel sentence. It had always been this way. Vanessa was the golden child, the undeniable star of the Jenkins family. She was beautiful, charismatic, and completely exempt from any real responsibility. Growing up, if Vanessa wanted designer dresses, my parents would empty their savings accounts without hesitation. When Vanessa went to college, they paid her tuition in full and bought her a brand new car as a graduation present. I was the exact opposite. I was the invisible workhorse. I was the human automated teller machine. They only approached when something was broken. When I wanted to go to college, my father told me I was not special enough to warrant the investment. He said I lacked the natural charm and potential that my sister had. I was forced to take out crushing student loans and work 3 different jobs just to pay for my accounting degree. I bought my clothes at thrift stores. I ate instant noodles in my tiny rented room. I built my career entirely on my own through sheer willpower and countless sleepless nights. They never celebrated my promotions. They never bragged about my forensic accounting license. But the very second they faced a financial crisis, they expected me to drop everything and clean up their mess for free. I was expected to sacrifice my time, my energy, and my professional integrity to ensure that the golden child could continue living her flawless life without interruption. I looked at my mother standing there defending my father. I looked at the chaotic piles of financial records threatening to destroy the family empire. I felt a surge of deep, bitter resentment welling up inside my chest. I wanted to turn around, walk out that glass door, and never look back. I wanted to tell them to hire a firm and pay the exorbitant fees they deserved. I wanted them to face the consequences of their own reckless actions. But then, the toxic guilt crept in. It was a deeply ingrained psychological reflex installed in me since childhood. If Jenkins Logistics collapsed, my parents would lose everything. The sprawling house would be foreclosed on. The luxury cars would be repossessed. Vanessa's lavish wedding would be instantly canceled, bringing devastating humiliation to the family. They would have absolutely nothing left, and they would blame me for the rest of my life. They would tell everyone they knew that Maya Jenkins let her own family go bankrupt because she was too spiteful to look at a few spreadsheets. The emotional manipulation was incredibly effective because it preyed on my core fear of abandonment. Deep down, a small, pathetic part of me still craved their approval. A part of me still believed that if I saved them this one time, if I proved how valuable and capable I truly was, they would finally look at me with the same pride and adoration they reserved for Vanessa. I thought that saving the family business would finally earn me a rightful place at their table. I let out a long, defeated breath. The warehouse was silent, except for the heavy drumming of the rain against the metal roof. I slowly took off my damp trench coat and draped it over a nearby chair. I walked over to the massive oak desk and pulled up a chair staring at the terrifying mountain of disorganized paperwork. I told my father I would do it. I told him I would cancel my weekend plans, take personal time off from my firm, and dig through every single box of receipts and invoices. I told him I would build a clean ledger and prepare the documentation for the IRS auditors. My father did not thank me. He simply nodded as if my compliance was nothing more than an expected duty. He grabbed his coat, kissed my mother on the cheek, and told me to lock up the warehouse when I was finished. Sandra gave me a tight, thin-lipped smile, reminding me to make sure the numbers looked perfect so Vanessa would not have to worry about a thing. Then they walked out of the office together, leaving me completely alone in the cold, empty building. I sat alone in the glaring fluorescent light, pulling the first box of bank statements toward me. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet. I was exhausted, but I was determined to work through the night to protect my family from ruin. I believed I was doing the right thing. I believed I was just organizing neglected files and fixing minor accounting errors caused by a careless bookkeeper. I had absolutely no idea that I was not just looking at messy bookkeeping. I had no idea that I was blindly stepping into a massive, highly orchestrated financial conspiracy. I did not know that by touching those files, I was activating a deadly trap that my own father had meticulously designed to destroy my life. I was just the obedient daughter trying to keep her family from becoming homeless. I did not know the horrific truth hiding in those numbers. The discovery I was about to make would shatter my reality and eventually lead to a loaded gun being pressed firmly against my head. Marcus Washington was the only genuinely good thing that had ever happened to my sister Vanessa. He was 32 years old, an African-American tech entrepreneur who had built a massive software firm down in Silicon Valley completely from scratch. He did not come from old money. He did not have a trust fund to fall back on when things got difficult. He had brilliant ideas, a relentless work ethic, and a moral compass that my parents could not even begin to understand. Marcus was grounded, incredibly kind, and he loved Vanessa with a fierce protective devotion that honestly surprised me. Vanessa had always been emotionally fragile. She was prone to intense anxiety attacks whenever things did not go exactly her way, or when she faced the slightest bit of pressure. It was a behavioral trait my mother Sandra had carefully cultivated for years to keep Vanessa entirely dependent on her. Sandra loved playing the savior to Vanessa's victim. Marcus saw her fragility not as a burden, but as something to cherish and protect. He treated her like spun glass. He was infinitely patient with her panic attacks and constantly reassured her of her worth. He was quite simply a fundamentally decent man, stepping blindfolded into a family of emotional predators. My father, Richard, recognized Marcus as a walking bank account the very first moment they met. Richard had spent the last 3 months slowly tightening a psychological noose around Marcus. I had watched it happen in real time during Sunday dinners and mandatory family holiday gatherings. Richard would pull Marcus into his private study, pour him a glass of impossibly expensive bourbon that the family could not actually afford, and play the role of the weary patriarch. He would sigh heavily and talk about the heavy weight of the family legacy on his tired shoulders. The pitch was always cleverly disguised as a private bonding moment between men of business. Richard would talk about legacy, about building an empire for the next generation, about how hard it was to find men who truly understood the burden of providing for a family. The real trap was set just 2 days before I found myself buried under that terrifying mountain of IRS notices in the warehouse. My father had cornered Marcus immediately after a wedding planning session at our house. I was in the kitchen washing dishes, invisible as always, while they stood in the living room. Richard told Marcus that Jenkins Logistics was facing a temporary cash flow issue due to an upcoming routine audit and some delayed vendor payments. He framed it as a minor bureaucratic hiccup that was freezing their operating capital. He did not ask for a loan outright. He pitched it as a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity for family only. He told Marcus he needed a $2 million cash injection to stabilize the accounts and secure the company for the next generation. Richard knew Marcus had recently sold a minority stake in his tech firm for 8 figures. $2 million was just a fraction of what Marcus was actually worth, but it was absolute salvation to Richard. When Marcus hesitated naturally, wanting to see formal financial statements before dropping millions of dollars into a freight company, my father deployed his ultimate weapon. He used Vanessa. Richard lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper and told Marcus that if the company went under, the financial stress would absolutely destroy Vanessa. He painted a vivid and tragic picture of a canceled wedding, a bankrupt family, and a devastated bride who would never recover from the public humiliation. He looked Marcus directly in the eye and said, "A real man protects his future wife from that kind of heartbreak." He told Marcus that Vanessa was already hanging by a thread with the wedding planning, and that hearing her family was destitute would send her into a severe depressive spiral. He weaponized Vanessa's mental health to guilt-trip a man who would do absolutely anything to keep her safe. It was a masterclass in emotional extortion, and Marcus, being the protector that he was, swallowed the bait. He promised Richard he would review the term sheet. The rain had finally stopped by the time I walked out of the Jenkins Logistics warehouse that night. It was past 2 in the morning. My eyes were burning and my shoulders ached fiercely from being hunched over those catastrophic ledgers for hours. The air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel fumes. The parking lot was slick and black, reflecting the harsh orange glow of the single flickering street lamp. I was exhausted to my bones, just wanting to get into my old sedan and drive home to my quiet apartment. I wanted to forget the numbers I'd been staring at. I wanted to forget the way my mother had casually dismissed my entire life to cater to my sister's wedding. But as I pulled my keys out of my coat pocket, I noticed a dark, heavy vehicle parked in the deep shadows near the back chain-link fence. The headlights flicked on for a brief second, blinding me before going totally dark again. A tall figure stepped out of the vehicle and walked deliberately into the dim pool of light. It was Marcus. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking entirely out of place in the grimy industrial park. He walked up to me, looking around nervously to make sure we were completely alone. He did not look like the confident tech founder I usually saw sitting at our family dinner table. He looked deeply unsettled and visibly exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes matched my own. He apologized quietly for startling me in the dark and said he had been waiting out there in his car for almost 2 hours, hoping I would eventually come out. I asked him what was wrong and why he was not at home with Vanessa. I told him it was freezing and that whatever this was, it could surely wait until morning. Marcus let out a heavy breath and rubbed the back of his neck, staring down at the wet pavement. He told me he loved my sister more than anything in the world. He said he would gladly pay for the entire wedding, the house, and anything else she ever needed to feel secure and happy. He said he did not care about the cost of the flowers or the venue. But he told me his gut was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with my father's investment pitch. Marcus was a self-made millionaire because he knew exactly how to read people, and he knew exactly how to analyze raw data. He built algorithms that detected market anomalies. His entire career was based on finding the hidden truth inside complex systems. He said Richard was pushing him relentlessly, demanding he sign a massive term sheet by the end of the week before the auditors officially arrived. Richard adamantly refused to provide any certified historical data, claiming the accounting department was just temporarily disorganized and that family should trust family. Marcus explained that Richard had given him a flashy presentation full of projected revenues and hypothetical profit margins, but absolutely zero verifiable tax returns or balance sheets. Every time Marcus asked for hard data, Richard would pivot back to talking about Vanessa's emotional well-being and the concept of family loyalty. Marcus said the emotional manipulation was a massive red flag in any business transaction, but because it involved the woman he loved, he felt entirely trapped. He did not want to be the reason Vanessa suffered, but he also knew that signing a blind contract for $2 million was corporate suicide. Marcus looked at me with genuine pleading in his eyes. He said he knew I was the only person in the family who actually understood forensic accounting. He knew I was the one inside that office seeing the real raw numbers. He knew that my parents treated me terribly, but he also knew that I possessed a fierce integrity that they completely lacked. He reached inside his overcoat and pulled out a thick manila folder. He held it out to me in the cold, damp air. The folder seemed to pull the gravity of the entire night toward it. He told me it was the term sheet and the preliminary financial summaries Richard had drafted for the $2 million buy-in. He begged me to look at them. He just wanted me to cross-check the numbers Richard had given him against the actual internal ledgers I was currently cleaning up. He said if the numbers matched reality, if the company was truly just facing a temporary cash flow problem, he would sign the papers and wire the $2 million the very next day to save the business. He would absorb the loss to keep Vanessa happy. But if they did not match, if the company was hiding something malignant, he needed to know the truth before he tied his personal assets, his reputation, and his future to Jenkins Logistics. I stared at the folder in his outstretched hand. I knew my father better than anyone. I knew his temper, his vindictiveness, and his absolute ruthlessness when he was cornered. I knew that if I took that folder and uncovered whatever he was desperately trying to hide, I would be crossing a line there was absolutely no coming back from. I would be directly interfering with his desperate attempt to secure a massive payday. If my father found out I was investigating him behind his back, he would destroy me. He would use every ounce of his power to ruin my career and alienate me from the family entirely. But looking at Marcus, seeing the absolute trust and desperation in his tired eyes, I knew I could not let a genuinely good man be destroyed by my toxic, manipulative family. Marcus was the only person who had ever looked at me with genuine respect. He saw my intelligence, while my parents only saw my utility. I could not stand by and watch my father drag him down into whatever dark financial abyss Jenkins Logistics was currently sinking into. I knew that choosing to help Marcus meant declaring war on my own blood, but blood had never protected me. Blood had only ever demanded my sacrifice. I slowly reached out and took the manila folder from his grasp. The thick paper felt heavy and damp in the cold night air. The moment my fingers closed around the document, a shiver ran violently down my spine. I promised Marcus I would review every single page and give him the absolute, unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly it was. I told him to go home and act completely normal around Vanessa and my parents. I told him not to sign a single piece of paper until he heard back from me. He thanked me, his voice thick with profound relief and gratitude. He told me I was saving his life and quickly walked back to his vehicle. As his taillights flared and then faded into the dark industrial streets, I stood entirely alone in the empty parking lot, clutching the folder tightly against my chest. The rain began to fall again, a fine cold mist that chilled me to the bone. I thought I was just doing a simple favor for my future brother-in-law. I thought I was just verifying some inflated revenue projections to protect him from a bad investment. I had absolutely no idea that accepting that term sheet was the exact moment I officially armed a ticking time bomb. The explosive countdown to the total destruction of my entire family had just begun, and there was no turning back. I walked to my old sedan and tossed the folder onto the passenger seat like it was a live grenade. The drive back to my small apartment was a blur of flashing streetlights and racing thoughts. My mind was already dissecting the possible scenarios. If Richard was just inflating the value of his fleet of trucks, that was one thing. That was standard desperate business practice. But the level of secrecy, the aggressive emotional manipulation, and the sheer panic I had seen in my father's eyes earlier that evening suggested something far more sinister. A company facing a standard IRS audit does not act like a cornered animal. A company with nothing to hide does not extort its future son-in-law for liquid cash in the middle of the night. When I finally walked through the door of my apartment, it was nearing 4 a.m. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I went straight to my small kitchen table, turned on my desk lamp, and opened the manila folder Marcus had given me. I spread the pages out under the harsh white light. The documents were drafted by a high-priced corporate attorney outlining a massive equity transfer in exchange for the $2 million capital injection. But it was the attached financial summary that made my blood run cold. The revenue numbers Richard had provided to Marcus were completely fabricated. I knew this instantly because I had just spent the last 6 hours looking at the actual gross income ledgers in the warehouse. Richard had inflated the quarterly earnings by over 400%. He had completely erased massive liabilities from the balance sheet, but the lies on the paper were only the beginning. The real danger lay in what the term sheet required Marcus to assume. It included a clause that made the new investor jointly liable for any existing corporate debts uncovered during future audits. My father was not just asking Marcus for an investment. He was legally chaining Marcus to a sinking ship, ensuring that when the IRS finally audited the company, Marcus would be on the hook for millions of dollars in back taxes and penalties. It was a calculated, predatory trap designed to drain Marcus of his entire fortune to cover my father's hidden mistakes. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my apartment pressing in on me. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. My parents were willing to sacrifice the financial security and the future of their own son-in-law just to maintain their luxurious facade. They were willing to risk Vanessa's marriage and her fragile mental stability to save their own skin. I realized in that quiet, terrifying moment that I was dealing with people who had no moral boundaries whatsoever, and if they were willing to do this to a man they supposedly welcomed into the family, I shuddered to think what they were preparing to do to me. I reached for my laptop, my fingers trembling slightly as I prepared to dig deeper into the company servers. I had the term sheet. Now I needed to find the actual black hole where all the missing money had gone. The ticking time bomb was no longer just armed. The fuse was burning rapidly toward a devastating explosion. The next 48 hours were a blur of blinding blue light from my dual monitors and the bitter taste of stale black coffee. I locked myself inside my tiny apartment, pulling the blinds shut against the relentless Seattle rain. I did not shower. I barely ate. I sat at my desk wrapped in an old fleece blanket, surrounded by the documents Marcus had given me and the massive data files I had copied from the Jenkins Logistics internal servers. My eyes burned and my fingers cramped from flying across the keyboard, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins made it impossible to sleep. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to look past the surface of financial statements and hunt for the hidden story buried in the raw data. Numbers do not lie. People lie, and my father, Richard, was a master at it. I started by taking the $2 million term sheet Richard had presented to Marcus. It was a beautiful piece of corporate fiction. My father had hired a very expensive attorney to draft a document that promised Marcus a lucrative equity stake in a thriving freight company. The projected revenue charts were flawless, showing steady growth and expanding profit margins. But when I began cross-referencing those polished charts against the actual raw ledger data from the company servers, the facade immediately cracked. I spent the first 12 hours simply tracing the daily cash flow. Jenkins Logistics was not just experiencing a minor cash flow hiccup, as my father had claimed. The company was bleeding out from 1,000 deliberate financial wounds. I noticed the first massive anomaly around hour 15. There were dozens of outgoing wire transfers buried deep in the accounts payable ledger, categorized vaguely as external consulting fees and international shipping tariffs. But Jenkins Logistics was a regional domestic freight company. We did not ship internationally. I ran a trace on the routing numbers associated with these payments. My heart started to race as the results populated on my screen. The money was not going to vendors or mechanics or supply chains. Millions of dollars were being siphoned completely out of the company and routed into a complex web of offshore shell corporations. I tracked one entity called Apex Global Management to a bank in the Cayman Islands. I tracked another to a holding company registered in Cyprus. My father was not a struggling small business owner victimized by a tough economy. He was systematically robbing his own company blind. I dug deeper, pulling the dates and timestamps of the largest wire transfers. I cross-checked them against my father's personal travel calendar from the past 3 years. The pattern was undeniable and utterly sickening. Every time Richard took a sudden weekend trip claiming he was attending a logistics conference in Las Vegas or a networking event in Macau, a massive wire transfer would hit one of the offshore shell accounts the very next day. He was not networking. He was gambling. My father had a catastrophic underground gambling addiction, and he was using his employees' livelihoods and his own company as his personal casino fund. He was laundering the stolen money through the offshore accounts to hide his massive losses from the IRS and the banks. A wave of profound nausea washed over me as I sat alone in my dark apartment. I thought about my mother, Sandra, defending him. I thought about her telling me to stop being selfish and to help my father clean up a simple accounting error. I wondered if she knew. I wondered if the designer clothes she wore and the luxury cars they drove were bought with the same dirty money. The betrayal cut so incredibly deep. They had weaponized my sense of family duty to make me complicit in a massive federal crime. They had treated me like a nuisance my entire life, but the moment they needed someone to cover up a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation, they suddenly remembered I existed. But the sheer panic, the true unadulterated horror, did not hit me until hour 36. I had proven the fraud. I had proven that Richard was stealing. But I still did not understand why he was so desperate to get exactly $2 million from Marcus right this second. $2 million would not cover the massive hole in his balance sheet. It would barely cover the interest on his hidden debts. There was a missing piece to this terrifying puzzle. I needed to see the actual bank loan documents and the official tax returns that Richard had submitted to the government. I needed to see exactly what lies he had put his signature on. I accessed a hidden restricted subfolder on the copied server drive. It was heavily encrypted, but my father had foolishly used my mother's birth date as the security key. I broke through the encryption and opened the master file for the company's corporate credit lines. I clicked on a massive PDF containing a commercial loan application submitted to a major national bank just 8 months ago. It was a request for a high-risk corporate loan based on the fraudulent revenue numbers I had just debunked. I scrolled down page after page of falsified financial declarations. I scrolled past the fake asset valuations. I finally reached the last page, the signature page. My heart stopped completely. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. I forgot how to breathe. I literally pushed my rolling chair back away from the desk, as if the computer screen itself was about to burn me. At the bottom of the federal loan document, directly beneath a legally binding declaration of financial accuracy under penalty of perjury, was a signature. But it was not my father's signature. It was mine. It clearly read Maya Jenkins, and right beneath my forged signature, typed in bold black letters, was a title I had never held: Chief Financial Officer. My hands began to shake so violently, I had to grip the edge of my desk just to stay upright. I leaned back and staring at the screen in pure disbelief. I opened another document, an official IRS tax return from 2 years ago. There it was again. My signature. My name, listed as the CFO of Jenkins Logistics. I frantically opened document after document. Equipment leases, credit line extensions, federal compliance forms. Every single piece of fraudulent paper, every single lie told to the United States government and the national banks bore my forged signature. The room started to spin. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. I felt a cold, terrifying sweat break out across my forehead as the absolute sheer evil of my father's master plan finally clicked into place. My father had not just forged my name out of convenience. He had meticulously and intentionally built a completely fabricated paper trail over the last 3 years. He had waited until I earned my CPA license, proving I was a certified financial professional. Then he had silently, legally positioned me as the ultimate authority over his company's finances. He had crowned me the fake CFO of his criminal enterprise. Richard knew the IRS was closing in. He knew the audit was going to uncover the missing millions, the offshore accounts, and the gambling debts. He knew the company was going to violently collapse and that federal investigators would be looking for someone to send to prison for a very long time. And he had deliberately chosen his own daughter to be the sacrificial lamb. If Jenkins Logistics went down, my father could easily claim ignorance. He could stand in front of a federal judge and say he was just a simple logistics man who trusted his highly educated forensic accountant daughter to manage the money. He would point to the dozens of documents bearing my signature. He would show the investigators that I was the CFO on paper. He would say I was the one who siphoned the money to offshore accounts. He would say I betrayed the family. He would walk away entirely free, playing the role of the devastated, betrayed father, while I was dragged away in handcuffs facing decades in federal prison for massive corporate fraud and money laundering. I wrapped my arms around my stomach and let out a dry, agonizing sob. The psychological devastation of that moment was unbearable. I had spent my entire 29 years on this earth trying to be good enough for them. I had accepted their neglect. I had accepted their cruelty. I had accepted that Vanessa would always be the golden child while I was just the invisible worker. But I had never in my darkest nightmares imagined that they actively wanted to destroy me. I thought they simply did not care about me. I did not realize they viewed me as nothing more than a human shield, a disposable object to be tossed into a federal prison cell just to keep my father out of one. When my mother told me to help my father and save the family, she was not asking me to do some late-night math. She was actively ensuring that the trap was set. She knew. She had to know. They both wanted me to organize the fraudulent files so that when the auditors arrived, my fingerprints would literally and digitally be all over the crime scene. They were locking me in the burning building and bolting the doors from the outside. And then my thoughts immediately snapped to Marcus. Marcus Washington, the brilliant, kind African-American tech founder who was about to marry my sister. The man who had looked at me in the dark parking lot with such genuine trust and desperation. I looked back at the $2 million term sheet lying on my desk. Suddenly, the lethal nature of that contract was glaringly obvious. The clause buried on page 12 was not just standard legal jargon. It explicitly stated that by injecting capital into the firm, the new investor assumed joint and several liability for the existing corporate structure. My father was not trying to save the company with Marcus's money. He knew the company was already dead. The $2 million was his escape fund. He was going to take Marcus's cash and run, but the contract was designed to trap Marcus in the exact same burning building with me. If Marcus signed that paper, he would legally become a core financial stakeholder in Jenkins Logistics right before the IRS brought down the hammer. Because Marcus was incredibly wealthy, the federal government and the defrauded banks would immediately go after his personal assets to recover the stolen millions. They would freeze his tech company. They would drain his bank accounts. They would drag his pristine reputation through the mud. Richard was going to destroy Marcus's entire life just to steal $2 million for his escape. And he was using Vanessa's emotional fragility, her extreme anxiety over the wedding, to force Marcus into signing the death warrant. My father was willing to financially ruin his future son-in-law and send his youngest daughter to federal prison all in one single stroke. I stood up from my desk, pushing the chair back so hard it crashed against the wall. I paced across the small living room, breathing in sharp, frantic gasps. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer monstrous reality of my own blood relatives. I felt incredibly small and deeply terrified. I was just a 29-year-old accountant. I was going up against a man who had spent years crafting an airtight federal trap around my neck. If I went to the police right now, with just a theory, my father would instantly claim I was a disgruntled daughter making up lies. He would show them the forged documents, and I would be arrested on the spot. If I confronted him, he would panic, destroy the servers, and leave me holding the bag. I walked into my bathroom and gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep. I looked like a victim. I looked like the frightened, invisible girl my parents had raised me to be. But as I stared into my own eyes, the terror slowly began to recede violently, pushed aside by something else. A hot, furious, burning rage. They had taken my childhood. They had taken my self-worth. They had stolen my confidence and treated me like garbage for almost 3 decades. But I absolutely refused to let them take my freedom. I refused to let my father sacrifice me to a federal judge, and I absolutely refused to let them destroy Marcus, a man who had treated me with more respect in 5 minutes than my parents had in my entire life. I splashed freezing cold water on my face. The shock of it cleared my mind completely. I walked back out to my desk and picked up my phone. It was 6 in the morning on a Thursday. I did not care. I dialed Marcus's private number. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him to listen to me very carefully. I told him not to sign a single page of that contract. I told him my father was not running a struggling business, but a massive money laundering operation, and that the term sheet was a legal trap designed to steal his wealth and frame him for federal tax evasion. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Marcus breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of its usual warmth. It was cold, sharp, and entirely focused. He did not question me. He did not ask if I was sure. He simply asked me what we needed to do next. I told him I was the fall guy. I explained the forged signatures and the fake CFO title. I told him that if we made the wrong move, Richard would destroy the digital evidence and I would go to prison. I told him we could not just walk away because the trap was already set around my neck. Marcus told me to pack up my laptop and bring every single document to a secure location. He said he knew exactly who we needed to call. We needed a lawyer who specialized in taking down white-collar predators. We were no longer just trying to prevent a bad investment. We were fighting for my life, and we were going to war against my own family. I packed my laptop and the printed financial ledgers into my heavy leather tote bag with hands that refused to stop shaking. The sky outside my apartment window was a bruised, heavy gray, completely blocking out the morning sun. It perfectly matched the crushing weight sitting entirely on my chest. I had just uncovered the terrifying reality that my own father had spent 3 years meticulously forging my signature to frame me as the criminal mastermind behind his multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. He had crowned me the fake chief financial officer of Jenkins Logistics to ensure I would take the fall when the federal government inevitably came knocking. I was running entirely on adrenaline and the bitter taste of stale coffee. I knew I had to get out of my apartment before my father found a reason to summon me back to the warehouse. I grabbed my car keys and practically ran down the stairs to the parking lot. I had texted Marcus an hour earlier asking him to meet me at a small independent coffee shop located on the absolute opposite side of the city. I deliberately chose a place my father would never visit. It was a tiny, dimly lit establishment tucked between an old laundromat and a used bookstore, far away from the polished downtown corporate high-rises my family preferred. When I walked inside, the air smelled strongly of dark roasted beans and damp wool from the rain-soaked coats of the few early morning patrons. I chose a small wooden booth in the very back corner, hiding myself behind a large potted fern. I sat facing the door, watching every single person who walked in with my heart hammering violently against my ribs. 10 minutes later, Marcus walked through the heavy glass door. Even in a simple, dark raincoat and a plain gray sweater, he commanded the room. Marcus Washington was a man who had built a massive tech empire from absolutely nothing. He carried himself with the quiet, focused authority of someone who solved incredibly complex problems for a living. He scanned the room, and his eyes instantly locked onto mine. As he walked toward my booth, I could see the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He looked exactly how I felt. He slid into the wooden booth across from me and took a slow, measured breath. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer any empty pleasantries. He took one look at my pale, terrified face and immediately asked me what I had found inside my father's company servers. I did not say a single word at first. I simply unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of printed documents. I placed the stack squarely in the center of the scratched wooden table. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic tremor in my voice. I told him that my father was not asking for a $2 million investment to solve a temporary cash flow problem. I told him that Jenkins Logistics was a rotting hollow shell that was bleeding out from 1,000 deliberate financial wounds. I opened the folder and slid the first document toward him. It was the internal gross revenue report. I watched Marcus as his eyes scanned the numbers. I pointed a shaking finger at the specific columns and explained that my father had artificially inflated the quarterly earnings by over 400% on the term sheet he had presented to Marcus. But that was just the superficial corporate lie. I then pulled out the wire transfer logs I had extracted from the restricted server files. I laid them out in a neat row across the table. I explained that millions of dollars were being systematically siphoned out of the operating budget and routed into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing as his brilliant analytical mind processed the raw data. I told him my father had a catastrophic underground gambling addiction. I showed Marcus how every single massive wire transfer to these offshore accounts aligned perfectly with my father's supposed weekend business trips to Las Vegas and Macau. My father was laundering stolen company funds to cover his massive illegal debts, hiding his losses from the IRS and the commercial banks. Marcus sat back in the wooden booth. He looked genuinely horrified, but his reaction was incredibly composed. He did not shout or slam his fist on the table. The sharp, highly intelligent tech CEO inside him instantly took control. He stared at the documents and stated very calmly that this was massive federal wire fraud and money laundering. He realized out loud that if he had signed that $2 million term sheet, my father would have taken his cash and immediately funneled it straight into those offshore accounts to cover his tracks. Marcus ran a hand over his face, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at the sheer audacity of my father's deception. He looked at me with profound gratitude and told me I had just saved his entire life. He said he was going to go straight to Vanessa and explain that he could not invest a single dime into a criminal enterprise. He said he would cancel the wedding planning if he had to, but he was going to pull all of his assets away from Jenkins Logistics immediately and walk away from my father forever. I felt a cold, terrible knot form in the pit of my stomach. I reached across the table and grabbed his wrist, stopping him from getting up. My grip was desperate and tight. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that if he walked away right now, my father would completely destroy me. Marcus stopped moving. He looked at me with deep confusion and asked what I meant. My hands began to shake all over again. I reached back into my leather tote bag and pulled out the final document. The kill shot, the document that had literally brought me to my knees in my dark apartment just a few hours ago. It was the official commercial loan application submitted to a national bank 8 months prior. I slid it across the table and pointed to the very last page. I did not say anything. I just let Marcus read it for himself. I watched as Marcus read the legally binding declaration of financial accuracy under penalty of perjury. I watched his eyes drop to the bottom of the page. I saw the exact moment his brilliant mind registered the horrific truth. He stared at the forged signature, reading the name Maya Jenkins directly above the printed title of Chief Financial Officer. Marcus looked up at me, his face entirely devoid of color. He asked me in a low, horrified whisper if I had signed this document. I shook my head slowly, tears finally spilling over my eyelashes. I told him I had never seen that document in my entire life until 3 hours ago. I explained that my father had secretly positioned me at the ultimate legal authority over his entire criminal enterprise. Every single falsified tax return, every fraudulent loan, every illegal wire transfer bore my forged signature. I told Marcus that my father knew the IRS audit was going to tear the company apart in less than 2 weeks. Richard knew he was facing decades in federal prison, and he had deliberately built a 3-year paper trail to ensure that I would take the fall. I told Marcus the agonizing truth about my mother, Sandra. I explained how she had manipulated me into going to the warehouse late last night. She had begged me to clean up the books to save Vanessa's wedding. She had used my lifelong desperation for her approval to lure me directly into the trap. They wanted my digital fingerprints all over those files, so that when the federal agents arrived, I would look like a guilty accountant, frantically trying to cover her tracks. I told Marcus that my own parents viewed me as nothing more than a human shield, a disposable object they could throw into a prison cell to save themselves. Marcus was absolutely silent. The gentle, kind man who had treated my fragile sister with such infinite patience was entirely gone. The man sitting across from me now was cold, calculating, and deeply furious. He realized the terrifying gravity of my situation immediately. I laid out the impossible reality of our predicament. I told Marcus that if he backed out of the investment today, Richard would instantly know that I had uncovered the truth. My father would panic. He would immediately destroy the physical server, shred the original ledgers, and hand the forged documents directly to the authorities, claiming his rogue accountant daughter had ruined him. Because I was a licensed forensic accountant, the authorities would believe him instantly. I would be arrested before the week was over. I told Marcus that if he walked away to protect himself, he would essentially be signing my prison sentence. I did not demand that he stay. I just laid my tragic reality on the table and let the tears stream down my pale face. I had spent my entire 29 years believing I was unlovable. I fully expected Marcus to apologize, to tell me he was so sorry, but that he had to protect his own future and walk out the glass door. But Marcus Washington did not run. He looked at me with a fierce, unyielding determination that I had never experienced from another human being. He reached across the scratched wooden table and covered my shaking hands with his own. His grip was warm and grounding. He told me in a low, steady voice that he was not going anywhere. He said no one was going to federal prison except the man who actually committed these crimes. He told me that my parents had drastically underestimated both of us, and that they had made a fatal mistake by trying to trap a tech founder who understood exactly how digital footprints worked. Marcus promised me right then and there that we were going to form an alliance. We were going to smile at my parents, pretend everything was perfectly fine, and systematically dismantle my father's empire brick by brick. Marcus said we needed to hire the most ruthless white-collar criminal defense attorney in the Pacific Northwest. We needed to secure my freedom legally before we ever let Richard know we were onto him. We had to fight back with overwhelming precision. For the first time in my entire life, I felt a profound sense of safety. I was not alone. The invisible daughter finally had a powerful ally who saw her worth and was willing to stand in the line of fire beside her. We sat in that quiet coffee shop for another hour, meticulously detailing our next moves. We agreed that Marcus would text Richard later that afternoon, claiming he was reviewing the term sheet and just needed a few minor legal clarifications before signing. This would buy us a few crucial days to secure my digital evidence and get a lawyer involved. We finally stood up from the wooden booth. My legs were shaky, but my spine was straight. I felt a surge of adrenaline replacing my terror. We were going to survive this. We walked out of the coffee shop together, stepping out into the cold, gray Seattle morning. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle. Marcus turned to me on the sidewalk and told me to go straight home, lock my doors, and get some sleep. He promised he would handle the lawyer and call me the moment he had an update. I smiled at him, feeling a massive weight lift off my tired shoulders. I watched Marcus walk toward his vehicle, feeling a deep, comforting sense of relief wash over me. We had a solid plan. We were going to outsmart my father. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone to check the time. The screen instantly lit up. The bright notification glared violently against the gray morning light. My phone buzzed aggressively in my palm, vibrating with a sharp, urgent rhythm that made my stomach drop instantly. It was a text message from my mother, Sandra. I stared at the glowing screen, my vision blurring slightly as I read the words. The text message did not say hello. It did not ask where I was or if I had finished the accounting work. The message was brutally short and laced with absolute venom. She asked me if I was currently trying to convince Marcus to abandon my sister. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. A wave of pure icy dread crashed over me, paralyzing my legs. I stood frozen on the wet sidewalk, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. The message continued. Sandra wrote that my father knew exactly what I had been doing on the company network last night. The air was violently sucked out of my lungs. The entire world seemed to tilt sideways. The profound sense of safety I had felt just 30 seconds ago completely evaporated, leaving me entirely exposed and vulnerable. Richard was not just a desperate business owner. He was deeply paranoid. I realized in a flash of pure horror that my father had installed advanced spyware on the Jenkins Logistics internal network. He had not just given me the files to review, he had laid a digital tripwire. When I had plugged my external hard drive into the server to copy the restricted banking compliance folders, the system had immediately flagged the massive data download. Richard had been notified the exact second I breached his encrypted files. He knew I had the wire transfer logs. He knew I had seen the forged commercial loan documents. He knew that I knew everything. And because he was tracking my digital footprint, he also likely tracked the location ping from my phone when I accessed the company email this morning. He knew I was meeting with Marcus. My parents knew that I was actively exposing their criminal conspiracy to the very man they were trying to extort. I was no longer flying under the radar. I was no longer the invisible daughter quietly doing her job in the background. The trap had not just sprung, it had clamped its steel jaws directly around my throat. Richard and Sandra knew I was a massive liability to their survival. They knew I held the evidence that could send them to prison, and they knew I was turning their golden goose against them. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the phone onto the wet pavement. I was officially in the crosshairs of a desperate man who had everything to lose. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that my father would not hesitate to destroy me to protect his own freedom. The ticking time bomb had just accelerated, and I was standing directly at ground zero, completely out of time. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone as the terrifying reality of my mother's text message washed over me. I was completely exposed. My father knew I had been digging through his restricted financial files. I had to assume he was already moving to destroy the evidence and pin the entire money laundering operation on me. My hands shook so violently that I almost dropped my phone onto the wet pavement outside the coffee shop. I took a deep breath of the freezing Seattle air, forcing oxygen into my burning lungs. I could not fall apart now. I immediately looked up at Marcus, who had just stopped walking and turned back to face me. I read the text message out loud to him, my voice cracking on every other word. I told him my father had advanced spyware on the company network and knew everything about the massive data downloads. I told him I was completely out of time. Marcus did not panic. His expression hardened into a look of absolute, unyielding resolve. He walked back over to me and placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. He told me to get into my car, lock the doors, and drive straight to a specific address in the financial district of downtown Seattle. He said we were officially done playing defense and we were going to take the fight directly to them. I drove through the relentless gray rain, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek, towering glass high-rise. Marcus was already waiting for me near the private elevators. He wore a sharp charcoal coat, looking every bit the ruthless tech executive he was, but his eyes were filled with a fierce, protective determination. He guided me into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. He told me he had just pulled a massive favor to secure an immediate emergency meeting with Jonathan Davis. Jonathan was not just any corporate lawyer. He was a notorious high-profile, white-collar criminal defense attorney who had built his entire career taking down corrupt executives and navigating brutal federal fraud cases. We walked out of the elevator and into a sprawling corner office overlooking the stormy harbor. Jonathan Davis sat behind a massive black marble desk. He had piercing sharp eyes and an incredibly intense predatory energy that immediately commanded the room. He did not offer any warm pleasantries or ask how I was feeling. He gestured for us to sit down in the heavy leather chairs opposite his desk and told me to explain exactly what I had found on the Jenkins Logistics servers. I laid out the entire horrific conspiracy without holding anything back. I explained the offshore shell accounts, the fake consulting fees, the artificially inflated revenue projections, and the devastating realization that my father had secretly forged my signature on federal tax documents and commercial bank loans to frame me as his criminal mastermind. I told Jonathan that my father knew I had discovered his secret just an hour ago and was undoubtedly preparing to hand me over to the federal authorities as the fall guy. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and listened in absolute silence. When I finally finished speaking, he let out a slow, measured breath. He looked at me with chilling clarity and explained the brutal reality of our legal situation. He warned us that paper copies of forged signatures are incredibly dangerous because they can easily be shredded or burned in a designated fire pit before the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever gets a search warrant. He said that in a federal courtroom, my father could simply argue that I printed those fraudulent documents myself to frame him for my own embezzling scheme. Because I was a licensed forensic accountant, a jury might actually believe I was capable of orchestrating such a complex cover-up. Jonathan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the smooth marble desktop. He said we needed digital forensics to survive this. He told me we needed to extract the raw internet protocol logs, the hidden server directories, and the digital email trails directly from my father's master server. He explained that those raw encrypted server logs would definitively prove that the forged documents were created, printed, and transmitted from my father's private locked office terminal and not from my standard employee computer. That raw metadata was the only undeniable proof that could save me from a 20-year federal prison sentence. I felt a cold, terrible knot tighten deep in my stomach. The master server was not stored on a remote cloud network because my father was deeply paranoid about external hacking. The physical server tower was located entirely offline inside his private executive office at the warehouse. The only way to extract those raw server logs was to physically plug an external hard drive directly into his master terminal. Jonathan looked at me intensely and asked if I still possessed my employee access codes and physical building keys. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what he was implying. I told him I had a master key from my previous late-night auditing shifts. Marcus immediately reached into his briefcase and pulled out a specialized solid-state drive. He placed it on the marble desk. He explained that the drive was heavily encrypted and specifically formatted by his own tech engineers to bypass standard administrative blocks and download massive amounts of data at lightning speed. Marcus looked at me with deep concern and offered to hire a private investigator to break into the building and do it for me. But I shook my head firmly. I told him a stranger would trip the silent perimeter alarms instantly. I knew the building layout better than anyone. I knew the exact patrol routes of the night guard. I knew exactly where my father hid the physical backup keys for the server rack underneath his desk. It absolutely had to be me. Jonathan warned me with a grave tone that if I was caught in the act, my father would instantly call the police and press charges against me for corporate espionage, effectively sealing my fate before we could even attempt to build a legal defense. The stakes were absolute life and death. If I failed, I would lose my freedom forever. I reached across the marble desk and took the encrypted hard drive from Marcus, sliding it deeply into my coat pocket. I looked at both of them and told them I was going in tonight. The drive back to the industrial park on the extremely dark edge of the city felt like a death march. It was nearly 2 a.m. The relentless rain had intensified into a torrential downpour, reducing my driving visibility to almost zero. The heavy, rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers was the only sound keeping me grounded as my mind raced with terrifying scenarios. I parked my old sedan 3 blocks away from the Jenkins Logistics warehouse, hiding it completely out of sight behind a long row of abandoned shipping containers. I pulled the heavy hood of my dark raincoat over my head, gripping the encrypted hard drive tightly in my right pocket. Every single step I took toward the massive facility felt like I was walking through thick, wet cement. The fear was a living, breathing entity inside my chest, threatening to paralyze my legs. But then, I forced myself to think about my mother standing by silently, while my father actively plotted to destroy my entire life. I thought about the sheer cruelty of their betrayal. The overwhelming fear crystallized into pure, focused adrenaline. I reached the side entrance of the massive corrugated metal building. My hands shook violently as I pulled out my physical master key. I slid the cold metal into the heavy deadbolt. I held my breath, praying to whatever was listening that my father had not already changed the exterior locks in a fit of paranoia. The key turned with a loud mechanical click that echoed sharply in the night. I quickly slipped inside, pulling the heavy steel door completely shut behind me. The interior of the warehouse was pitch black, except for the faint, eerie amber glow of the emergency exit signs casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. The air smelled strongly of damp cardboard and stale engine oil. The silence in the massive space was deeply oppressive, broken only by the distant mechanical humming of the commercial freight refrigerators. I mentally calculated my timing. I knew I had exactly 45 minutes before the night guard conducted his mandatory sweeping patrol of the executive floor. I moved silently through the dark, cavernous space, my wet sneakers making absolutely no sound against the smooth concrete. I reached the metal staircase, leading up to the glass-enclosed executive suites. I crept up the steps slowly, keeping my body pressed completely flat against the plaster wall to avoid casting any visible silhouettes that could be seen from below. When I reached the top landing, I looked down the long carpeted hallway. My father's office was at the very end. The frosted glass door was shut tight. I approached his office and used my key to unlock the door, stepping inside, and immediately closing the thick vertical blinds to shut out the faint light from the street lamps outside. The room was freezing cold. I pulled a small pen light from my pocket, casting a narrow beam of white light across the pristine executive space. I walked around his massive oak desk and knelt down onto the carpet. The master server tower was locked inside a ventilated metal cabinet built directly into the wall beneath his desk. I reached under the rim of his middle desk drawer, running my trembling fingers along the rough wood until I felt a small piece of electrical tape. I pulled it loose, retrieving the tiny brass key hidden underneath. My father was a creature of rigid habit. He never changed his hiding spots. I unlocked the metal cabinet, pulling the heavy door open to expose the blinking green and blue lights of the master server. I pulled Marcus's encrypted hard drive from my coat pocket. My heart was hammering so violently against my ribs, I thought it might actually crack my sternum. I found the primary universal serial bus port and plugged the drive firmly into the machine. I carefully opened my father's laptop, sitting on the desktop, and booted it up. The monitor flared to life, casting a harsh, pale light directly across my face. I bypassed the standard login screen, using the advanced administrative backdoor protocol I had learned during my forensic training. I swiftly initiated the extraction sequence, mapping the command terminal to pull all raw internet protocol logs, all hidden email directories, and every single restricted financial file on the system. A thick progress bar appeared squarely in the center of the screen. The file size was absolutely staggering. 50 gigabytes of raw, undeniable criminal evidence waiting to be transferred. The progress bar began to crawl forward. 1%, 2%. It was excruciatingly slow. Every passing second felt like an eternity, stretching my nerves to their absolute breaking point. I sat on the floor staring at the glowing blue line, pleading silently in my mind for it to move faster. The heavy silence of the office amplified every single sound around me. I could hear the rain lashing violently against the exterior glass windows. I could hear the low, steady humming of the server cooling fans. 10%, 15%. My palms were sweating profusely, making the plastic casing of my pen light slippery. I wiped my hands aggressively on my jeans, desperately trying to keep myself grounded and steady. 25%, 30%. I checked my wristwatch. I had been inside the executive office for exactly 20 minutes. The night guard was scheduled to begin his upward patrol in 10 short minutes. I desperately needed the download to finish. I needed to get out of this building before my entire life was completely destroyed. 40%, 50%. The progress bar seemed to freeze entirely for a terrifying, agonizing moment before creeping forward once again. Then, my blood ran entirely cold. I heard it. A distinct, sharp, metallic clank echoing loudly from the bottom of the stairwell outside. The heavy security door connecting the warehouse to the executive stairs had just been forcefully opened. The night guard was early. He was starting his patrol right now. I heard the slow, heavy thud of his thick work boots ascending the metal stairs, echoing loudly in the quiet building. Panic seized my throat. I looked back at the laptop screen. 65%. I could not pull the drive out now. If I interrupted the complex extraction sequence, the data would be permanently corrupted, and the server would automatically flag a critical security breach, notifying my father instantly on his personal phone. I was completely trapped in the room. The footsteps grew steadily louder, reaching the top landing of the hallway. I saw the bright sweeping beam of a heavy-duty flashlight cut sharply across the frosted glass of the office door. He was walking down the hallway, heading directly toward my father's office. I scrambled backward, sliding completely under my father's massive oak desk. I pulled my knees tightly against my chest, wrapping my arms fiercely around my legs to make myself as physically small as possible. I held my breath, clamping my hand firmly over my own mouth to muffle the sound of my ragged, terrified breathing. The heavy footsteps stopped right outside the door. I saw the dark, imposing shadow of the guard, looming ominously against the frosted glass panel. He rattled the brass doorknob, aggressively checking the lock. It held secure because I had relocked the deadbolt from the inside the moment I entered. But the bright, intense beam from his tactical flashlight swept back and forth across the glass, trying to pierce the darkness of the room. He lingered there for what felt like hours. My heart was pounding so incredibly loud, I was absolutely certain he could hear the frantic thumping echoing through the thin drywall. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, praying desperately for him to walk away. The light from the laptop screen was shielded by the heavy wood of the desk, but the ambient glow illuminating the floor felt terrifyingly bright. After an agonizing minute that stretched my sanity to its absolute limit, the dark shadow finally shifted. The guard grunted quietly to himself, apparently satisfied that the room was secure, and continued walking down the long hallway to check the remaining office doors. I waited until the sound of his heavy boots completely faded away into the distant corridors of the warehouse before I dared to let out a shaking breath. I slowly crawled out from under the desk and looked up at the laptop screen. 95%. 98%. 99%. A small solid green checkmark finally appeared on the center of the monitor, accompanied by a faint digital chime that signaled the massive extraction was completely successful. I did not waste a single second. I safely ejected the hard drive, yanking the metal cord directly from the server port. I shoved the drive deep into my coat pocket, holding onto it like it was the most precious thing in the entire world. It was my absolute freedom. It was my total vindication. I quickly shut down the laptop, locking the server cabinet tight and replacing the hidden brass key exactly where I had found it under the desk drawer. I wiped down the desk surface and the keyboard with the sleeve of my coat, ensuring I left absolutely no physical trace or fingerprint behind. I crept out of the office, pulling the door shut and locking it seamlessly behind me. I practically flew down the metal stairs, moving as silently as a ghost through the dark warehouse. I reached the side exit, pushed the heavy steel door open, and bolted straight into the freezing rain. I ran all the way back to my hidden car, completely soaked to the bone, but gripping the hard drive in my pocket with a fierce, triumphant joy. The raw data was secure. The undeniable proof was finally in my hands. The lethal trap my father had spent 3 years meticulously building to destroy me was about to be turned completely and utterly against him. The small solid green checkmark on the laptop screen was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my entire life. It was the absolute confirmation that 50 gigabytes of raw, undeniable criminal evidence had been completely transferred to Marcus's encrypted hard drive. I felt a massive wave of pure euphoric relief crash over my exhausted body. I reached out with a trembling hand and gripped the small metal casing of the drive. I took a deep breath, pulling the device free from the universal serial bus port. I expected the screen to simply return to the standard administrative desktop. I expected to quietly lock the metal cabinet beneath my father's massive oak desk and slip away into the dark, rainy night exactly the same way I had entered. But the universe had a very different plan for me. The absolute second the metal connector severed its physical link with the master server, the laptop screen violently flashed from a calming blue to a blinding, aggressive crimson red. My heart completely stopped beating in my chest. The breath was instantly sucked out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the freezing air of the executive office. A large, bold text box materialized directly in the center of the crimson screen. It read, "Unauthorized data extraction. Complete silent trigger activated." My father had not just installed standard corporate firewall protections on his internal network. He had anticipated that someone might eventually try to bypass the digital blocks by physically plugging into the terminal. He had paid thousands of dollars to a private cybersecurity firm to install a lethal digital tripwire. The system was specifically designed to remain entirely dormant while the data was being copied, completely lulling the intruder into a false sense of absolute security. The trap was only designed to spring the very moment the physical connection was broken. I knew with terrifying, absolute certainty that a high-priority security alert had just been instantly transmitted directly to my father's personal smartphone. He knew someone was inside his office. He knew the files had been taken. I shoved the encrypted hard drive incredibly deep into the front pocket of my heavy raincoat. Panic flooded my veins like liquid ice. I had to get out of the warehouse immediately. I scrambled up from the carpeted floor, not even bothering to close the metal cabinet doors or shut down the compromised laptop. I sprinted across the dark executive office, my wet sneakers sliding dangerously on the polished hardwood floors. I grabbed the brass doorknob and yanked the heavy frosted glass door open. I threw myself into the long, dark hallway. My chest was heaving with ragged, terrified gasps. The silence of the massive industrial building felt incredibly heavy and deeply oppressive. I reached the top of the metal staircase and gripped the cold steel railing. I practically flew down the stairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. The sound of my desperate footsteps echoed loudly throughout the cavernous, empty space, amplifying my sheer terror. I reached the bottom landing and sprinted directly toward the heavy steel exit door on the far side of the loading bay. My eyes were fixed entirely on the small red exit sign, glowing faintly in the darkness. It was my only ticket to survival. I slammed my hands against the thick metal crash bar, throwing my entire body weight forward, expecting the door to swing open into the freezing Seattle rain. The door did not move a single inch. I slammed my shoulder against the steel, crying out in pure frustration and terror. I pushed again with absolutely everything I had, but the heavy metal remained completely rigid. A loud mechanical hum suddenly vibrated through the steel frame. My father had remotely engaged the heavy-duty magnetic security locks. I was entirely trapped inside the building, like a rat in a cage. Before I could even turn around to look for another possible exit, a sound pierced the heavy darkness. It was the sharp, distinct sound of a slow, deliberate hand clap. The noise echoed from the opposite side of the massive warehouse floor, bouncing off the corrugated metal walls and the parked shipping trucks. Then the overhead industrial lights snapped on in sequence. A blinding wave of harsh white fluorescent light violently flooded the entire facility, instantly erasing every single shadow. I squeezed my eyes shut against the sudden burning glare, holding my hand up to shield my face. When I finally opened my eyes, my father Richard was standing directly in the center of the concrete loading floor. He was not disheveled or panicked like he had been 2 nights ago. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. His silver hair was impeccably combed. He looked exactly like the incredibly powerful, untouchable corporate chief executive he had always pretended to be. He stood with his feet planted firmly apart, his posture radiating absolute control and supreme arrogance. He held a thick, pristine white envelope in his right hand, gently tapping it against the palm of his left hand in a slow, rhythmic motion. He looked at me standing terrified by the locked exit door, and a slow, deeply malevolent smile spread across his face. He called my name in a voice that was chillingly calm and entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. He told me I was so incredibly predictable. He slowly walked toward me, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete. He stopped about 10 feet away, maintaining a comfortable, authoritative distance. He explained that he had known for 3 days that I was snooping through his restricted files. He told me the night guard was never actually doing a routine patrol. The guard was specifically ordered to walk past the office door, just to apply psychological pressure and ensure I stayed perfectly still while the silent extraction trigger armed itself. My father gloated that he had watched my entire pathetic attempt to play the hero play out exactly as he had orchestrated it. I pressed my back hard against the cold steel of the locked exit door, clutching the fabric of my raincoat over the pocket that held the hard drive. I found my voice despite the violent trembling in my jaw. I told him he was a complete monster. I told him I had the raw server logs and the offshore routing numbers. I told him I knew everything about his catastrophic gambling addiction, the money laundering, and the horrific forged documents bearing my signature. I shouted at him that the digital proof was currently sitting in my pocket and that I was taking it straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation the absolute second I got out of this building. My father simply laughed. It was a dark, booming sound that completely chilled my blood. He took another step closer, his eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory intensity. He told me that going to the police was the absolute worst mistake I could possibly make. He held up the pristine white envelope in his hand and slowly opened the flap. He pulled out a thick stack of glossy printed pages and fanned them out like a deck of playing cards. He explained that he had not just forged my signature on the commercial bank loans and the federal tax returns. He had spent the last 8 months meticulously fabricating an entire digital universe to completely destroy my credibility. Richard explained his master plan with the pride of a psychopathic architect, admiring his own creation. He told me the envelope contained a perfectly constructed evidence file. It contained hundreds of fake internal company emails sent between my registered employee address and various anonymous offshore accounts. He had generated fake Internet Protocol access logs showing that my specific work terminal had manually initiated every single illegal wire transfer over the past 3 years. He even boasted that he had created a secret bank account in the Cayman Islands completely under my name, using my social security number and my childhood pet's name as the security password. He looked me dead in the eye and told me the raw data I just downloaded was completely irrelevant because the entire company network had been intentionally poisoned with this fabricated evidence weeks ago. He said the files in my pocket would only prove to the federal authorities that I was actively stealing company data to cover up my own massive corporate embezzlement scheme. My knees felt incredibly weak. The sheer scale of his calculated evil was utterly suffocating. He had anticipated every single move I could possibly make, and he had systematically blocked every single exit. He was entirely confident because he had built a cage so perfectly designed to fit my exact dimensions that I had walked into it completely blind. He knew involving the police right now would only accelerate his own downfall, but he also knew that if he handed this fabricated file to the authorities, they would arrest me by tomorrow morning. I would be locked in a federal holding cell, desperately trying to explain complex digital forensics, while he walked away completely free. Richard lowered the stack of papers, and his expression hardened into something incredibly dangerous and lethal. He issued his ultimatum in a voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He told me that Marcus and I were going to attend a mandatory family dinner at the Jenkins estate tomorrow night at exactly 7 o'clock. He demanded that we arrive looking perfectly happy and completely compliant. He stated that during this dinner, I was going to sign a legally binding notarized confession. The document was already prepared. It detailed my complete and total responsibility for the missing millions, the offshore accounts, and the fraudulent tax filings. By signing it, I would voluntarily take the entire fall for the collapse of Jenkins Logistics, shielding the family name from any criminal liability. He did not stop there. The ultimatum extended to the man who had tried to save me. Richard demanded that Marcus bring his personal checkbook to the dinner. He dictated that Marcus was going to sign the $2 million term sheet and authorize the immediate wire transfer of funds directly into the company accounts before dessert was served. Richard told me that if we complied, if I signed my life away and Marcus handed over the cash, he would hold on to the fabricated federal evidence file. He would allow me to quietly face the audit, take a plea deal for lesser charges, and maybe only serve 5 to 7 years in a minimum security prison camp. He offered this complete destruction of my entire future as if it was a profound act of fatherly mercy. I stared at him, my mind violently rejecting the reality of his words. I asked him how he could possibly do this to his own daughter. I asked him how he could look at me, the child he was supposed to protect, and willingly send me to a federal prison just so he could keep playing golf at the country club. Before Richard could even answer, another figure stepped out from the deep shadows near the loading dock manager office. The sharp, distinct click of expensive high heels echoed on the concrete. It was my mother, Sandra. She was wearing a perfectly tailored beige trench coat over a designer evening dress, looking absolutely immaculate at 2 a.m. Not a single blonde hair was out of place. Her makeup was flawless. She walked over and stood directly beside my father, placing a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. The visual image of them standing together, united in their absolute determination to completely destroy me, broke the very last piece of my heart. Sandra looked at me with cold, dead eyes. There was absolutely no maternal warmth, no hesitation, and no regret in her expression. She looked at me the exact same way she looked at an expired coupon at the grocery store. It was an expression of total irritated dismissal. She spoke in a calm, steady voice that completely shattered my soul. She told me that I needed to stop being so incredibly dramatic and simply take the fall to protect the family name. She said the Jenkins family reputation was the most important thing in the world, and that I was completely ruining Vanessa's wedding week with my selfish behavior. Sandra crossed her arms over her chest and delivered a monologue of pure, unadulterated psychological abuse. She told me that I had always been the difficult child, the one who never quite fit into their perfect social circles. She said I lacked Vanessa's grace and elegance, and that my career as an accountant was entirely unglamorous and embarrassing to talk about at her social club. She stated that because I had no real prospects for a brilliant marriage or high society success, I owed it to the family to absorb this damage. She actually rationalized my father stealing millions of dollars as a simple business mistake that a loyal daughter should gladly go to prison for. She told me I was strong and hardened, and that I would easily survive a few years locked away. She contrasted this by claiming Vanessa was far too delicate and beautiful to ever handle the stress of a family bankruptcy. Sandra looked me directly in the eye and said I was finally being useful for something important. She demanded that I show up tomorrow night, sign the confession, and fulfill my ultimate purpose as the invisible foundation that kept their perfect lives entirely intact. I stood paralyzed against the locked steel door, listening to the two people who brought me into this world completely dismantle my humanity. They did not see a daughter standing in front of them. They saw a scapegoat. They saw a disposable asset. They had spent my entire life breaking down my self-esteem, ensuring I felt entirely unworthy of love, so that when the day finally came to sacrifice me, I would simply lower my head and comply. They fully expected me to break down, crying beg for their minimal mercy, and agree to go to prison just to finally earn a sliver of their twisted approval. But as I looked at Sandra, perfectly composed and entirely devoid of a soul, and Richard clutching his fabricated evidence file with a smug, victorious grin, the terrifying, paralyzing fear inside my chest suddenly vanished. It did not fade slowly. It evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I realized in that exact moment that I had absolutely nothing left to lose, because I had never actually had a family to begin with. The parents I had desperately tried to please for 29 years were completely dead to me. The people standing in front of me were simply dangerous predators who needed to be completely and utterly destroyed. I did not scream at them. I did not throw myself on the concrete floor and weep. I slowly pushed myself away from the cold steel door, standing up entirely straight. I smoothed the wet fabric of my raincoat, holding my head incredibly high. I looked at my father, and then I looked at my mother. I kept my voice perfectly flat, completely void of any trembling or emotion. I told them I understood the terms of their arrangement perfectly. I said I would see them tomorrow night at 7:00 for the family dinner. Richard smiled broadly, clearly believing he had won the psychological war. He thought my calm demeanor was simply the complete submission of a broken daughter who had finally accepted her tragic fate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small remote control, and pressed a single button. The loud mechanical hum of the magnetic locks instantly deactivated. The heavy steel door behind me unlatched with a loud, echoing clank. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the dark, rainy exit with a mockingly polite wave of his hand, telling me to drive safely and that they would be expecting Marcus to bring his checkbook. I turned my back on them, entirely refusing to give them the satisfaction of a final, terrified glance. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out into the freezing, relentless downpour. I walked across the wet, slippery asphalt of the industrial parking lot, moving with a steady, deliberate pace. The rain soaked completely through my coat, chilling my skin, but the cold fire burning furiously in my chest kept me moving forward. I reached my hidden sedan, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately, pulling the encrypted hard drive out of my pocket and placing it carefully on the passenger seat. I sat alone in the dark car, listening to the rain drum heavily against the roof. My parents honestly believed they held all the cards. They believed their fabricated evidence file was a flawless checkmate. They believed Marcus was just another wealthy victim they could easily extort, but they had made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed I was still the terrified little girl who desperately wanted their love. They assumed I was weak. They had absolutely no idea that I had just spent the last 48 hours speaking with Jonathan Davis, the most ruthless white-collar defense attorney in the state. They had no idea that the raw server data on the seat beside me was specifically designed by elite tech engineers to bypass fabricated files and extract the true digital foundation of the network. They thought they had cornered an obedient daughter, but they had actually just declared a total, unmitigated war on a licensed forensic accountant who possessed the exact tools required to completely dismantle their entire lives. The family dinner tomorrow night was not going to be my execution. It was going to be the absolute total and devastating destruction of the Jenkins family empire, and I was going to burn it completely to the ground. The drive to my parents' house in the affluent suburbs of Portland felt like moving through thick, deep water. Marcus drove his sleek black SUV in absolute silence. His jaw was set tight. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a calm, terrifying focus. I sat in the passenger seat watching the familiar manicured lawns and towering oak trees glide past the window. This was the neighborhood where I grew up. This was the street where I had spent my entire childhood trying to make myself small enough to fit into a family that never actually wanted me. Tonight, I was returning to the house that held every single one of my worst memories. But this time, I was not arriving as the obedient, invisible daughter. I was arriving as a woman who finally understood her own worth and was carrying the exact tools needed to bring this entire toxic empire crashing down to the ground. When we pulled into the long, sweeping driveway, my parents' house looked exactly as it always did. The exterior lights illuminated the pristine white columns and the perfectly manicured shrubbery. It was the ultimate picture of upper-class success and respectable suburban wealth. It was a massive, beautiful lie. We parked behind Vanessa's luxury coupe. Marcus turned the engine off and looked over at me in the dim light of the cabin. He did not say a word, but he gave me a slow, grounding nod. We stepped out into the crisp evening air. My heart was thumping a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was completely clear. I opened the heavy oak front door and we stepped into the grand foyer. The house smelled strongly of roasted garlic, expensive floral arrangements, and my mother's overpowering signature perfume. It was the exact smell of every suffocating holiday dinner I had ever endured. We walked down the wide hallway and entered the formal dining room. The scene before us was an absolute masterpiece of psychological manipulation. The long mahogany table was set for 4 people. The good crystal glasses were out. The silver gleamed under the massive chandelier, but there was no food on the table. Instead, sitting directly in the center of the polished wood were 2 thick manila folders. My father Richard stood at the head of the table. He was wearing a dark suit, looking perfectly groomed and entirely in control. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch. My mother Sandra was standing near the arched entryway to the kitchen. She wore a tailored navy dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her face an unreadable mask of cold determination. But it was my sister Vanessa who broke the heavy silence. She was sitting at the table, clutching a crumpled linen napkin. She was an absolute wreck. Her face was blotchy, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. She wore a silk designer lounge set that looked entirely out of place in the formal dining room. The second Marcus walked through the doorway, Vanessa sprang from her chair and threw her arms around him. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. She did not ask him how his day was. She did not ask him if he was okay. She immediately launched into a frantic, desperate plea. She begged him to just help our dad. She cried that the wedding was only weeks away, and that if the business failed, the caterers and the florists would cancel everything. She sobbed that she could not face the humiliation of a canceled wedding. She told Marcus that he had more than enough money to fix this tiny little problem, and that if he truly loved her, he would just sign whatever Dad needed him to sign, so they could go back to planning their perfect life. Vanessa was completely in the dark. She had absolutely no idea about the offshore accounts, the money laundering, or the federal tax fraud. She did not know that our father was facing decades in federal prison. All she knew was that her perfect, flawless world was being threatened, and she expected Marcus to simply open his wallet and make the bad things go away. My father had clearly spent the entire day feeding her a heavily edited version of the truth, whipping her extreme anxiety into a frenzy, specifically so she would act exactly like this the moment Marcus arrived. She was the ultimate emotional leverage. Marcus gently but firmly peeled Vanessa's arms away from his neck. He held her shoulders, looking down at her tear-stained face with an expression of profound sadness. He did not say he would fix it. He just told her to sit down and breathe. Vanessa let out a dramatic wail and collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. That was when Sandra made her move. My mother walked past me without making eye contact. She walked straight out of the dining room and down the hall to the front entrance. I heard the heavy mechanical click of the top deadbolt engaging, then the secondary lock, then the security chain. Sandra walked back into the dining room, reached into the pocket of her tailored dress, and produced the heavy brass keys. She dropped them directly into her pocket and crossed her arms over her chest. She stood, completely blocking the hallway. We were now physically locked inside the house. The trap had officially snapped shut. Richard took a slow sip of his scotch and set the crystal glass down on the mahogany table with a sharp clink. He gestured to the two empty chairs opposite him. He did not ask us to sit. He commanded it. Marcus and I took our seats side by side. Richard leaned forward, resting his hands on the two manila folders. He looked at Marcus with a forced, incredibly fake smile of fatherly warmth. He started his pitch playing the role of the benevolent patriarch who was just trying to keep his family safe. He told Marcus that the business was facing an aggressive hostile audit and that they needed the $2 million capital injection by tomorrow morning to stabilize the accounts. He tapped the first folder and said all Marcus had to do was sign the investment term sheet. He promised that Marcus would see a massive return on his investment within the year. He used words like family legacy duty and protection. He pointed to Vanessa, who was still weeping softly into her napkin, and told Marcus that a real man does whatever it takes to secure his wife's happiness. Then Richard turned his cold, dead eyes onto me. He slid the second folder across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of me. He did not bother with fake warmth when he spoke to me. His voice was hard flat and completely transactional. He told me the folder contained a notarized legal confession. He stated that I was going to sign it right now. The document officially admitted that I, as the chief financial officer of Jenkins Logistics, had acted entirely alone in mismanaging the company funds. It stated that I took full and complete responsibility for any and all discrepancies the auditors might find. Sandra chimed in from the doorway, her voice dripping with venom. She told me to stop staring at the folder and just pick up a pen. She said it was time for me to finally be useful to the people who raised me. She told me to take the fall, to protect the family name, because my career did not matter, and Vanessa's future did. She said I owed them this sacrifice for everything they had done for me. I looked down at the folder. My name was typed clearly on the front. Maya Jenkins, Chief Financial Officer. It was the ultimate lie demanding my physical signature to make it real. If I signed that paper, I was voluntarily handing the federal government the exact weapon they needed to lock me away for 20 years. I looked up at Marcus. He was staring at the $2 million term sheet in front of him. He did not open the folder. He did not reach for the expensive fountain pen Richard had placed on the table. Marcus just looked at the cover of the document for a very long time. The dining room was completely silent, except for Vanessa's muffled crying and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Marcus slowly lifted his head and looked directly into my father's eyes. The gentle tech entrepreneur was completely gone. The man sitting next to me was a self-made multimillionaire who had navigated the most cutthroat boardrooms in Silicon Valley. Marcus spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm, perfectly level, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. Marcus said no. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He simply stated that he was not signing the term sheet. He told Richard that he did not invest in fraudulent shell games, and he certainly did not finance offshore money laundering operations. The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Vanessa's crying stopped instantly. She lowered her napkin, staring at Marcus with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Sandra stiffened her perfectly manicured hand, gripping the doorframe. But Richard completely froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the harsh glare of the chandelier. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine panic flash in his eyes. He realized in that exact moment that his brilliant, flawless plan was completely unraveling. Marcus knew. Marcus knew about the dark money. Richard tried to recover. He forced a harsh, unnatural laugh and slammed his hand on the table. He demanded to know what Marcus was talking about. He accused Marcus of being paranoid and disrespectful. He raised his voice, trying to dominate the room through sheer volume, claiming that Marcus was insulting the Jenkins family name in their own home. Marcus did not blink. He leaned forward and told Richard that the game was entirely over. He said he knew the revenue numbers were fabricated. He said he knew Jenkins Logistics was a hollow shell, completely insolvent, and drowning in illegal debt. He looked at Vanessa and then back to Richard, stating that he would not be extorted to cover up a federal crime. He told Richard that he was walking out of this house tonight and taking his money with him. That was the exact moment my father lost his mind. The transition from cornered corporate criminal to absolute violent psychopath happened in the blink of an eye. Richard realized that his manipulation had failed. He realized that the $2 million he desperately needed to escape the country was walking out the door. He realized that Marcus was not going to be the fall guy. And he realized that I was not going to quietly sign my life away. Richard let out a primal, furious roar. He reached behind his back, plunging his hand into the waistband of his tailored trousers. Before anyone could even process what was happening, he pulled out a dark, heavy object. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh, cold glare across the metallic surface of a Glock 19. Vanessa let out a blood-curdling, visceral scream. She scrambled backward, her wooden chair tipping over and crashing onto the hardwood floor. She scrambled into the corner of the dining room, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing in absolute hysterics. Marcus lunged forward, but he was too late. Richard did not aim the weapon at Marcus. He moved with terrifying speed, rounding the edge of the mahogany table and lunging directly at me. He grabbed a massive fistful of my hair, yanking my head back so hard my neck cracked. A blinding flash of pain shot down my spine. I tried to pull away, but he dragged me out of my chair, forcing me to my feet. He wrapped his thick arm around my throat, locking me against his chest, and jammed the cold steel barrel of the gun directly against my right temple. The metal was freezing. It bit into my skin, sending a shockwave of pure, primal terror through my entire nervous system. I could feel his chest heaving against my back. I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. He was trembling violently. The gun shook against my skull. Marcus froze instantly, holding his hands up, his eyes locked onto the weapon pressed against my head. He told Richard to put the gun down, his voice tight with controlled panic. He begged Richard to think about what he was doing. Richard screamed over him, his voice echoing deafeningly in the dead silence of the house. He yelled that he had spent his entire life building this family, and he was not going to let a spoiled tech kid and an ungrateful daughter destroy him. He shoved the barrel harder against my temple, making my vision swim with pain. He pointed his free hand at the table, screaming at Marcus to sign the transfer documents right now. He screamed that nobody was leaving this house until the money was in his account, and my name was on the confession. I looked over at my mother. Sandra was still standing by the entryway. She was not screaming. She was not running forward to protect her daughter from a loaded weapon. Her face was completely chalk white, but she simply stood there clutching the brass keys tightly in her pocket. She looked at me with cold, dead eyes and muttered that I should just do what my father said. She told me to stop being difficult and sign the papers to save the family. They were willing to kill me. The realization was absolute and final. My own father was holding a gun to my head, and my mother was guarding the door to make sure I could not escape. They were completely unhinged, driven by pure desperate greed and the terrifying reality of federal prison. The perfect family facade was completely shattered, leaving only the monstrous truth behind. The little girl who used to crave their love was dead. I was a hostage in my own childhood home, staring down the barrel of my father's desperate madness, and the true nightmare of the evening had only just begun. The cold steel barrel of the Glock 19 dug violently into my right temple. The freezing metal sent a shockwave of pure primal terror directly through my nervous system, but I forced myself to remain completely still. My father's breathing was incredibly heavy and ragged, smelling of expensive scotch and raw, desperate panic. He screamed at me to pick up the expensive fountain pen lying on the mahogany table. He demanded that I sign the fabricated confession, taking the absolute full fall for his multi-million-dollar money laundering operation. Across the formal dining room, my mother Sandra stood guarding the heavily deadbolted front door. Her face was a mask of cold, aristocratic determination. She told me to stop crying and simply do my duty to protect the Jenkins family name. She demanded that I go to federal prison so they could maintain their flawless country club lifestyle. They honestly believed they had won. They thought they had cornered the weak, invisible daughter and finally broken her into total submission. But they were incredibly wrong. They had absolutely no idea what was actually happening. I did not reach for the pen. I did not beg for my life. Instead, I focused my entire mind on the subtle, gentle vibration pulsing rhythmically against my left wrist. It was my Apple Watch, hidden completely out of sight beneath the long, dark sleeve of my sweater. I had not walked into this dining room as a terrified victim. I had walked into this house as live bait. Hours earlier, when Marcus and I were sitting securely in Jonathan Davis, the elite white-collar defense attorney's high-rise office, we had meticulously anticipated this exact violent escalation. Jonathan warned us that a man as desperate, arrogant, and cornered as my father would never simply accept rejection. Richard would use physical force to secure the signatures and the $2 million. So, we engineered a trap of our own. A trap so legally devastating and flawlessly executed that my parents would never see it coming until it completely destroyed them. Right before I stepped out of Marcus' black SUV in the sprawling driveway, I had activated a highly secure, encrypted live audio streaming application on my watch. The microphone was incredibly sensitive, capable of picking up a whisper from across the room. At this exact second, that live feed was transmitting crystal clear, high-definition audio directly to a secure receiver. Jonathan Davis was not sitting at his marble desk downtown. He was sitting inside a dark, unmarked federal surveillance van parked exactly 1 block away from my parents' affluent suburban estate. And he was not alone. He was sitting shoulder to shoulder with a highly armed tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every single psychotic threat my father made, every demand for Marcus to hand over $2 million, every cold demand from my mother telling me to take the fall for their crimes was being recorded and permanently logged as irrefutable federal evidence in real time. But I needed the absolute final nail in their coffin. I needed Richard to confess to the forgery out loud. I let out a shaky, terrified breath, playing the role of the shattered daughter to absolute perfection. I looked up at my father, tears streaming down my pale face, and asked him in a trembling whisper why he chose me. I asked him how he managed to put my name on all those commercial bank loans and federal tax documents without me ever knowing. Richard laughed. It was a harsh, booming sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance, echoing loudly through the formal dining room. His massive ego simply could not resist the opportunity to gloat over his brilliant master plan. He loosened his grip on my hair just a fraction, keeping the gun pressed firmly against my skull, and began to brag. He proudly admitted that he had been forging my signature for 3 entire years. He boasted about legally listing me as the chief financial officer of Jenkins Logistics the moment I earned my certified public accountant license. He detailed exactly how he systematically siphoned millions of dollars into offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to completely cover his catastrophic illegal gambling debts. He practically gloated about fabricating the internal digital network to frame me, ensuring the federal authorities would find my digital fingerprints on every single fraudulent wire transfer. He literally spelled out his entire multi-million-dollar money laundering operation and his premeditated conspiracy to frame his own daughter for federal tax evasion. I slowly turned my eyes toward my mother. I asked Sandra if she knew about the trap. I asked her if she helped him set me up. Sandra lifted her chin, crossing her arms over her tailored navy dress. She completely incriminated herself without a single ounce of hesitation. She proudly stated that they had orchestrated the entire plan together. She admitted she was the one who brilliantly suggested using Vanessa's wedding as the ultimate emotional leverage to force me into the warehouse late last night. She said they needed me to physically touch the restricted files so the network spyware would log my presence, instantly confirming my guilt to the auditors. She coldly reiterated that I was a complete disappointment to the family and that sacrificing my freedom was the only way I could ever repay them for raising me. I felt a profound, deeply settling sense of cold victory wash over my soul. The live audio feed had captured absolutely everything. The armed extortion, the physical threats, the detailed confession of systemic corporate fraud, and the active conspiracy to commit federal perjury. They had literally handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly wrapped criminal conviction on a silver platter. I let out a slow, steady breath. The frantic trembling in my voice completely vanished. I looked up at my father, and the tears in my eyes dried instantly. My expression shifted from absolute terror to chilling, absolute calm. I looked him dead in his bloodshot, desperate eyes and told him I was never going to sign that confession. Richard completely froze. The arrogant, smug smile instantly vanished from his face. He pressed the cold gun barrel violently harder against my temple, his finger tightening dangerously on the trigger. He screamed at me, telling me I had absolutely no choice. He screamed that he would pull the trigger and kill me right here in the dining room if I did not immediately pick up the pen. But before he could utter another violent threat, a sound pierced the heavy, suffocating silence of the affluent neighborhood. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the far distance. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing exponentially louder and more aggressive. It was the screaming wail of police sirens. Not just one or two, but dozens of them screaming down the manicured suburban streets and turning directly into our sprawling driveway. The color instantly drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking completely gray and sickly. His eyes darted frantically toward the heavy silk drapes covering the dining room windows. The wailing sirens were now completely deafening, accompanied by the aggressive screeching of heavy tactical tires tearing into the pristine gravel. Suddenly, a chaotic, massive explosion of blinding red and blue strobe lights violently illuminated the entire dining room, flashing frantically through the sheer curtains and painting the formal walls in sharp, erratic colors. My mother let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She dropped her hands to her sides, staring at the violently flashing lights in absolute, uncomprehending shock. Vanessa, who was still cowering on the floor in the corner, let out a piercing, hysterical scream, covering her ears. Marcus instantly lunged forward, grabbing my arm and yanking me violently out of my chair, pulling me entirely out of Richard's immediate grasp and shielding me safely behind his broad shoulders. Richard stumbled backward, dropping his arm. The heavy Glock 19 wavered in his violently trembling hand. He looked at the locked front door, then back at me, his mind completely unable to process how his flawless, brilliant plan had disintegrated in a matter of seconds. He muttered over and over that this was impossible. He said the house was completely secure. He said absolutely nobody knew. I stood safely behind Marcus and looked my father right in the eye. I told him I had been broadcasting his entire detailed confession to the federal authorities for the last 20 minutes. Before Richard could even begin to react, a booming mechanical voice echoed through a heavy-duty police megaphone outside, completely shaking the very foundation of the massive house. The voice commanded Richard Jenkins to drop the weapon and step away from the hostages immediately. A split second later, a deafening explosive crash completely shattered the quiet elegance of the grand foyer. The heavy custom oak front door, the exact door my mother had so proudly locked and deadbolted to trap us inside, was violently kicked open with such extreme kinetic force that the heavy wood splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The brass deadbolts ripped cleanly out of the doorframe, bouncing loudly across the polished marble floor. A heavily armed tactical SWAT team flooded into the grand foyer and poured directly into the formal dining room. The air was instantly filled with the sharp, aggressive shouting of federal agents. Dozens of blinding white tactical flashlights cut violently through the dim light of the crystal chandelier, pinning my father securely against the far wall. Bright red laser sights danced erratically across his chest and forehead. The agents commanded him to drop the weapon and get on the ground, shouting with overwhelming lethal authority. The absolute shock of the violent dynamic breach completely broke my father. The powerful, arrogant corporate executive vanished entirely, leaving behind a pathetic, deeply terrified old man. His knees buckled instantly. The Glock 19 slipped from his sweaty, trembling fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, dull thud. He slowly raised his hands high in the air, dropping heavily to his knees and surrendering completely to the overwhelming force of the federal government. Two heavily armored agents instantly converged on him, forcing him flat onto his stomach and violently wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around his wrists echoed loudly through the room. It was the sound of absolute final justice. My mother, Sandra, completely lost her mind. The perfect aristocratic facade she had maintained for decades violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She collapsed onto the floor, clutching her designer navy dress, screaming and sobbing in pure, unadulterated hysterics. She reached out desperately toward the tactical agents, crying that there was a massive mistake, crying that she was a highly respectable woman, crying that she belonged to the elite country club and could not possibly be treated this way. A female federal agent grabbed her arms, pulling her roughly to her feet and reading her Miranda rights in a cold, completely mechanical voice. Sandra wailed, thrashing against the heavy restraint, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling wildly into her tear-streaked, makeup-smeared face. She was completely, utterly broken. Vanessa remained huddled in the corner, hyperventilating and weeping uncontrollably. She watched her perfect parents, the very people who had always shielded her from every single consequence, being dragged away in federal handcuffs. Her flawless reality, her dream wedding, her entire privileged existence, was burning completely to the ground right in front of her eyes. Marcus kept a firm, highly protective arm around my waist, shielding me from the absolute chaos, ensuring I was completely safe. Then the chaotic shouting slowly began to quiet down as the agents fully secured the room. The sea of dark tactical uniforms parted, clearing a wide path through the shattered doorway of the grand foyer. Walking smoothly through the splintered remains of the front door, looking entirely unbothered by the absolute destruction surrounding him, was Jonathan Davis. He wore a pristine dark suit, his overcoat perfectly unwrinkled. He carried a heavy sealed metallic briefcase in his right hand. He walked slowly into the dining room, his sharp, predatory eyes surveying the absolute wreckage of my parents' lives with a look of cold, intense, professional satisfaction. He stepped carefully over the overturned dining chairs and walked directly to the head of the mahogany table. Jonathan looked down at my father, who was now kneeling on the floor, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his face pressed hard against the polished wood. Jonathan placed the heavy, metallic briefcase squarely on the center of the table, directly next to the fraudulent confession Richard had tried to force me to sign. He popped the heavy metal latches with two sharp, simultaneous clicks and opened the heavy lid. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of dark protective foam, was the encrypted solid-state hard drive I had stolen from my father's master server the night before. Jonathan looked down at my father and spoke in a voice that was perfectly smooth and entirely lethal. He formally introduced himself as Maya Jenkins' exclusive legal counsel. He gestured to the open briefcase and explained that the drive contained 50 gigabytes of raw, unedited Internet Protocol logs, internal emails, and hidden offshore banking transfers extracted directly from Richard's private offline terminal. He stated that the digital forensics experts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already completely verified the raw metadata, proving absolutely that the forged documents, the fake corporate emails, and the offshore Cayman Island accounts were all created directly by Richard himself. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his hands firmly on the table. He told my father that the raw digital evidence aligned perfectly with the live audio confession he had just generously broadcasted to the federal surveillance van parked outside. He said, my father had provided the federal government with the complete motive, the exact method, and the absolute undeniable proof of his own overwhelming guilt. Jonathan smiled a cold, incredibly chilling smile and told my father that his incredibly meticulous trap was a true masterpiece of corporate fraud, but he had made one fatal, catastrophic error. He had severely underestimated the daughter he deemed entirely worthless. Richard looked up from the floor, his face completely stripped of all remaining color. He looked at the hard drive resting in the briefcase. He looked at Jonathan Davis. And finally, he looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated, absolute shock. He finally realized the absolute terrifying magnitude of what I had done. I'd not just refused to be his tragic victim. I had meticulously, systematically, and brilliantly engineered his total, absolute destruction. I had used his own extreme paranoia, his own blind arrogance, and his own insatiable greed to build a federal cage so perfectly airtight he would never see the outside of a prison cell again. I stood there next to Marcus, looking down at the toxic people who had abused me for 29 years. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single shred of guilt. I felt completely, deeply, and wonderfully free. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried my entire life was completely gone. I was no longer the invisible workhorse. I was no longer the human shield. I was a brilliant survivor who had fought back with overwhelming, devastating precision, and I had absolutely won. The federal agents pulled my father roughly to his feet, shoving him toward the shattered front door. My mother followed, dragging her feet and wailing desperately into the cold night. As they were escorted out into the violently flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminating the affluent suburban street, I knew my life would never be the same. I had completely burned my toxic family tree to its very roots. But as Marcus squeezed my hand and smiled down at me, I knew I was finally entirely ready to plant something new. That is my story. I went from being a completely disposable pawn in a massive corporate fraud scheme to the absolute architect of my own systemic justice. I proved that blood does not ever demand blind loyalty, especially when that blood is entirely toxic and manipulative. If you are watching this and you feel trapped by manipulative family members who only value your utility, I need you to understand something very important. You do not owe your life to people who actively refuse to respect your basic humanity. You have the absolute right to set boundaries. You have the absolute right to walk away. And if they try to destroy you, you have the absolute right to fight back with absolutely everything you have. Do not ever let anyone make you feel invisible. You are significantly stronger than you think, and you hold the absolute power to write your own ending. Thank you so much for watching. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Drop a comment below and let me know what time it is where you are watching from. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always trust your own immense worth. See you in the next video. The heavy silence that fell over the dining room after the federal agents dragged my parents out the shattered front door was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The blinding red and blue strobe lights from the police cruisers, parked on the manicured lawn, cast long dancing shadows across the mahogany table, but I did not feel afraid anymore. I stood next to Marcus, breathing in the cool night air, blowing through the splintered oak door, and felt the massive, suffocating weight of 29 years completely lift off my shoulders. The meticulous trap my father had spent 3 years building to send me to federal prison had officially snapped shut on his own neck. The sheer magnitude of the evidence we handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation was absolutely insurmountable. Jonathan Davis had delivered a masterstroke. The raw, encrypted server logs I had extracted the night before aligned flawlessly with the crystal-clear, live audio recording of my father's arrogant, unhinged confession. The federal prosecutors did not offer my father a single ounce of leniency. Richard had detailed his entire money laundering operation, his offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, his illegal gambling debts, and his deliberate, premeditated forgery of my signature. He had admitted to orchestrating the entire corporate fraud while actively holding a loaded weapon to my head. There was absolutely no room for his expensive lawyers to spin a defense or negotiate a plea deal. During the sentencing hearing, he stood in the sterile federal courtroom completely stripped of his tailored suits and his country club arrogance. He was just a pathetic, broken man wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. The judge looked at him with absolute disgust and handed down a crushing sentence. Richard was given 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was convicted of massive corporate wire fraud, aggravated tax evasion, and armed assault. The man who had spent my entire life telling me I was completely worthless and incapable of success was going to spend the rest of his natural life staring at gray concrete walls. My mother, Sandra, did not escape the catastrophic blast radius of my father's downfall. She was not just an innocent bystander or a clueless spouse. She had proudly confessed on that live audio feed to being an active, willing co-conspirator. She had admitted to orchestrating the psychological manipulation required to lure me into the warehouse late that rainy night. She had actively guarded a locked door while my life was literally threatened. The federal government charged her as an active participant in the massive financial fraud and the aggressive cover-up. Because the stolen money was so incredibly extensive, the government immediately moved to seize absolutely all of their assets for mandatory restitution. The sprawling suburban estate, the luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, the expensive jewelry, the rare art collections, absolutely everything was confiscated and auctioned off to pay back the defrauded banks and the Internal Revenue Service. Sandra was left completely and utterly bankrupt. The woman who had built her entire identity on projecting immense upper-class wealth and looking down her aristocratic nose at everyone else was forced into a harsh, unforgiving reality. She had to move into a tiny, cramped, low-income apartment on the grim industrial outskirts of the city. She had no country club memberships, no wealthy socialite friends, and absolutely no money to maintain her flawless facade. A few months after the trial, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I answered it. It was Sandra. Her voice lacked the cold venom she had always directed at me. Instead, she sounded incredibly small, desperate, and pathetic. She was crying hysterically, telling me she was entirely out of money and begging me to pay her rent, so she would not be evicted onto the street. She tried to use the exact same toxic guilt trips she had weaponized my entire life, telling me I owed her because she was my mother and she had raised me. She expected me to instantly revert to being her invisible human automated teller machine. I sat in my quiet, peaceful living room and let her finish her desperate sobbing speech. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply told her that she completely lost the right to call herself my mother the night she stood by while a loaded gun was pressed against my head. I told her I owed her absolutely nothing. I hung up the phone and I permanently blocked her number. I severed the cord completely and let her sink into the absolute ruin she had actively created for herself. The total destruction of the Jenkins family empire was an absolute psychological cataclysm for my sister Vanessa. The protective blindfold she had worn her entire life was violently and permanently ripped away. She was forced to see our parents not as loving protectors who only wanted the best for her, but as ruthless, calculating predators who were entirely willing to destroy my life and actively extort her future husband just to save their own skin. She was completely devastated. The perfect, flawless reality she had always known was revealed to be a highly toxic, parasitic illusion. But hitting absolute rock bottom was exactly what Vanessa desperately needed to finally wake up. For the very first time in her life, she actively chose to step away from the incredibly toxic dynamic that our mother had engineered. She finally realized her extreme anxiety and her perpetual fragility had been carefully cultivated by Sandra, specifically to keep her dependent and easily controlled. Marcus was an absolute pillar of strength through the entire agonizing ordeal. By acting quickly and securing the elite legal defense of Jonathan Davis, he had successfully protected his own tech company and his massive personal assets from the massive federal fallout. His hard-earned wealth remained entirely untouched by my father's desperate greed. But more importantly, he stood firmly and loyally by Vanessa's side as she painstakingly learned how to navigate the real world. He did not treat her like a fragile porcelain doll anymore. He actively encouraged her profound independence. He supported her completely as she started going to intensive therapy to unlearn decades of Sandra's deep, emotional manipulation. Their massive, lavish wedding, the opulent social event of the year that my mother had been obsessing over to show off to her friends, was immediately postponed. But the delay did not weaken their relationship in the slightest. Without the constant toxic interference, the emotional extortion, and the heavy expectations of my parents, their bond actually grew significantly stronger. They were finally building a true equal partnership based on genuine trust, deep, mutual respect, and actual love, rather than familial manipulation and financial leverage. As for me, the Federal Bureau of Investigation fully and completely exonerated me of all potential charges. The raw internet protocol logs and the highly encrypted digital email trails I had so carefully extracted from the master server definitively proved that my father had manually initiated every single fraudulent transaction directly from his locked private office terminal. The audio recording of his confession explicitly confirmed he had systematically forged my signature on the commercial bank loans and federal tax documents for 3 entire years entirely without my knowledge. I received an official letter from the Department of Justice formally clearing my name and permanently closing their investigation into my professional conduct. The suffocating, terrifying threat of federal prison was completely and eternally lifted from my shoulders. I was a completely free woman, with my professional integrity entirely intact. I never returned to my old accounting firm. I had survived an absolute baptism by fire, and I realized my specific specialized skills were incredibly valuable. I took a massive, terrifying leap of faith and used my intense, grueling personal experience to open my own elite forensic accounting firm. I chose to specialize entirely in uncovering incredibly complex, white-collar fraud tracking, hidden offshore assets, and aggressively exposing the exact kind of sophisticated corporate deception my father had tried to use to bury me alive. Because I knew exactly how these ruthless financial predators operated and exactly how to dismantle their hidden digital networks, my firm became incredibly successful very quickly. I hired a team of brilliant, dedicated analysts who shared my fierce commitment to absolute justice. I permanently moved out of my tiny, depressing apartment and bought a beautiful, spacious home filled with massive windows, natural light, and a profound, quiet peace. I systematically cut every single tie with the intense toxicity of my past. I completely stepped out of the dark, oppressive shadows where my manipulative family had deliberately kept me hidden for 29 long years. I was no longer the invisible workhorse waiting for crumbs of affection. I was the absolute, confident architect of my own incredibly successful, unapologetic life. Blood is not a free pass for ongoing exploitation. We are so often conditioned by society to believe that we must endure endless abuse simply because the people hurting us happen to share our genetic code. We are told to forgive to keep the peace and to sacrifice our own well-being to maintain a toxic family facade. But the truth is that biological connection does not excuse malicious behavior. If the people who brought you into this world are willing to completely destroy your life, your career, and your mental health simply to save their own, you owe them absolutely nothing. Walking away from an environment that actively seeks to diminish and exploit you is never an act of betrayal. It is a fundamental, mandatory act of pure survival. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and you cannot build a healthy future while remaining chained to people who actively want to see you fail. True family is built on mutual respect, genuine support, and unconditional love, not on constant emotional extortion and deep financial manipulation. If you have ever had to fight tooth and nail to take your life back from highly toxic family members, drop the words "I am free" in the comments below. Let me know that you survived and that you are building something entirely your own. Your story matters, and your strength is incredibly valid. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for more stories like this one. Guard your boundaries with everything you have, because they are the absolute foundation of your peace. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small or invisible just to serve their own selfish narrative. You deserve to be the priority in your own life. Thank you so much for listening, and please take wonderful care of yourself.